In the middle of a fierce snowstorm, a woman's lifeless body lay still. Her shape held the sad story of her past. No one knew how long she'd been there, slowly freezing to death. By the time she ended up like this, she had no friends or family left to save her. The ice-covered woman wasn't alone that day. A man approached her. He knew her story and muttered about how cruel it was to leave her to die in the cold. He couldn't just walk away, so he stepped closer and called her Empress. She stared at him with empty eyes as he spoke. Since she didn't seem to care about her own life, he told her he'd take her for himself. When she recognized him, she closed her eyes, exhausted. He lifted her into his arms, cradled her head and looked down at her with a cold gaze. "You belong to me now," he said. The Empress's life had always been tragic, but the worst came 3 months earlier. Natasha, the Emperor's mistress, had spent years whispering in his ear, pushing him to turn against his wife. Like a snake, she wrapped herself around him, planting ideas of betrayal. Her words twisted his mind. He smirked when she told him his wife had stolen his power. The Thanatos Empire was supposed to be his, but the Empress was too skilled in politics. She overshadowed him, leaving him weak. Natasha kept pushing. She suggested framing the Empress's brother, accusing him of rape. As a member of the Imperial Council, she knew the crime would ruin him. Her fingers trailed over the Emperor's chest as she explained how it would destroy the Empress too. If she defended her brother, the people would hate her. Then, they'd plant evidence of treason in his office. A fake letter would claim he acted out of hatred for Natasha and the Emperor. After laying out her plan, Natasha stroked the Emperor's cheek, then suddenly turned rough. She pinned his hands to the bed and climbed on top of him. "Break her limbs first," she demanded. "Then kill everyone she loves, family, servants, friends." The final blow would come at a banquet. The Empress would walk in unaware. Natasha would stand before the crowd and announce she carried the Emperor's child. With her brother's crimes and her own jealousy, the Empress would be accused of trying to kill Natasha and the unborn heir. That would be the end of her reign. Gigliotti doesn't really grasp what Natasha is saying because his mind is stuck on the one time he slept with her. Without pausing, Natasha tells him that after the Empress's actions, he'll have no choice but to draw his sword and kill her and her family. Running her fingers along the Emperor's neck as he drowns in pleasure, she smirks and says her rival will have to be very sneaky to avoid getting caught. She adds coldly that once she's alone it won't matter how clever or resourceful she is. Sometime later, the 17th Empress, Thanatos, finds herself at the edge of another painful twist in her already hard life. By then, thanks in part to the Emperor, she's become lame and can only walk with a cane. Sunset Rosalind V was known as the noblest, most beautiful, and perfect empress in the empire's history. She wasn't just a brilliant writer but also a skilled diplomat who spoke 6 languages. She often opened new hospitals, genuinely caring for the sick and poor. People loved her because she would spend hours at the bedsides of the ill, comforting them. Despite her limp, no one dared mock the cold, elegant Rosalind for her disability. The only one who didn't share this admiration was the infamous Emperor. His growing hatred came from many things, including the fact that they'd never had children. Rosalind stands quietly in the hallway, knowing this man has ruthlessly destroyed all her supporters, even her own family. Her maid watches her nervously, sensing the dark thoughts swirling in Rosalind's mind but also the determination not to give up. The maid feels sorry for her, remembering how Rosalind had returned that day, even with a broken leg. Despite the injury, she had calmly assured everyone she was fine. Now, staring at the Empress's back, the maid can't believe how cruel fate has been to her. Rosalind hears music drifting from the banquet hall next door, almost like an invitation. She freezes in front of the door, unsure what waits for her inside. When the maid calls out anxiously, Rosalind turns. The girl struggles to speak, her voice trembling. Sensing her fear, Rosalind tries to reassure her, asking her to open the door. The maid nearly shouts, promising to stay with her until the end. Rosalind cuts her off. But the words make her think of all the loved ones she's lost, some to illness, others to accidents she knows the Emperor caused. Looking at Anna, her fist pressed to her chest, Rosalind realizes she's the last one left who's still loyal. She can't lose her too. Keeping her voice steady, she orders Anna to run if anything happens to her. Anna starts crying, saying she's prepared everything they'll need at a safe house by the beach. At first, she refuses to leave, but when she sees Rosalind only wants to protect her, she finally walks away. The Empress smiled when she heard her name, Rosie. It had been a long time since anyone called her that. Anna urged Rosalind to wait a few days for the Earl's help. He was working to save the Sunset family. The conversation was hard for the Empress too, but she kept her composure and softly asked Anna to open the door. Unable to refuse, Anna finally let her in, not knowing the room would become Rosalind's personal hell. Rosalind stepped forward into a noisy hall filled with guests and loud music. Then, she came face to face with her biggest enemy, Gigliotti, who sat smugly on the throne. He tensed, noticing that despite her injury, she walked with the same confident stride as always. Their eyes locked, and he thought she looked creepy with that unreadable gaze. Mockingly, he asked how she'd managed to walk in with her bad leg, staring down at her. Rosalind refused to back down. She smirked and shot back that just because her leg didn't bend didn't mean she couldn't walk. Her sharp reply got under his skin, and he gritted his teeth, calling her a witch in his mind. Nearby, two men overheard the exchange. One was the foreign minister of Amor, Rosalind's enemy nation. He was surprised she'd even shown up after all the obstacles thrown her way. Meanwhile, the argument between Rosalind and Gigliotti grew heated until she pushed him to rage with a smug remark. Even though she was winning the fight, Rosalind knew she'd still lose in the end. She thought sadly of her family, who had fought so hard to protect their heirloom. But before she could dwell on it, Natasha Rouhani appeared ready to end this deadly game. Like a rose dripping with blood, Natasha approached the shocked empress. With fake remorse, she hid behind a fan and begged for punishment without saying why at first. Then, in the middle of the hall, she dropped the bombshell. If she'd told Rosalind she was carrying the emperor's child, her brother wouldn't have hurt her. The guests gasped in shock. Rosalind froze, anger and betrayal burning inside her. Natasha kept up her act, pretending to be guilty while secretly smirking. Then, without warning, she grabbed Rosalind's hand and in one swift move, pulled out a hidden knife from her fan. Suddenly, Natasha collapsed to the floor. Rosalind stared in confusion. How had the knife ended up in her own hand? Natasha lay still, fake blood spreading from her stomach like a gruesome performance. The guests rushed over, just as stunned as Rosalind. Even the Amor minister and his assistant were shocked. They hadn't expected such a clever trap. His eyes widen in shock as he sees everyone worried about Natasha's health, all while they treat Rosalind like a villain. The emperor, sitting quietly, hides a grin, secretly pleased the woman has finally been caught. He plays along, suddenly leaping to his feet, shouting for soldiers and waving his arms wildly. Nearby, the empress stands frozen, as if drowning in silence while the emperor's bloody mistress lies at her feet. The mistress smiles, satisfied her plan to destroy the empress's power has worked perfectly. When the order comes to surround the empress and help the victim, no one moves. The room stays still, the only sound the bright red stain spreading on the floor. Gigliotti barks out a command, ending the banquet and telling everyone to leave. Just like that, Rosalind is left alone in the country she once served with all her heart. The Amor delegation is furious, knowing she might not survive the winter. As expected, the empress is thrown into a dungeon, guarded by stone-faced soldiers. The emperor tortures her for hours, desperate to find the family heirloom. But no matter how much pain he inflicts, whipping her back, tearing out her nails, beating her until she's covered in blood, she never breaks. Outside, rumors spread, sparking a riot. People demand her freedom, gathering in crowds begging the emperor for mercy. He watches coldly from his balcony, expecting the protest to fade. But it only grows, his face twisting with anger. Meanwhile, the empress hangs by her wrists, barely conscious. Her clothes are torn rags soaked in blood, only her long hair remains of her beauty. Ice water shocks her awake, and she opens her eyes to see the emperor smirking at her, arms crossed. Their eyes lock, his full of triumph. Hers unbroken. Outside, the people's cries grow louder. He tells her he'll spare her life and she should be grateful. Then he signals two executioners, ordering her exile to the frozen mountains of Kralturia. But that's not all. He grabs her attention, showing her two chests. With a cruel smile, he flings them open, revealing the heads of her dead parents. For a moment she can't breathe. Then, with a scream that shakes the dungeon, she lunges forward, shrieking his name. The woman is immediately stopped by two shady servants, forcing her head down with a sharp stick pressed against her skull. Gigliotti watches with obvious amusement, smirking as her face twists in anger. Pinned to the floor, she glares at him, silently swearing she'll never forgive him for this. Nearby, a man dressed in black, like a warrior from the end of days, stands motionless. He scans the city before him, deciding it's time to leave instead of lingering. A deep, burning anger rises in him, anger over the empress of an enemy nation being overthrown. He doesn't fully understand why he feels this way, but his eyes lock onto a tower in the distance. One day he'll tear it down with his own hands. A red-haired man on horseback interrupts his thoughts, riding up from behind. At first he doesn't see what his companion to man is staring at, but then he spots the courtyard of Thanatos behind him. A sly grin spreads across his face. Maybe recent events have gotten to Taman after all. He nudges him, casually mentioning where the Empress was exiled. When Taman stays silent, the red-haired man adds, almost mockingly, that he's sorry things turned out this way. The words trigger memories in Taman meetings with the Empress, the way she stood above the rest. Without a word, he yanks the reins, wheeling his horse around. His comrade barely has time to react before Taman is already galloping away, leaving him shouting uselessly after him. Meanwhile, the Empress lies motionless in the snow, silently cursing Gigliotti for this cruel end. Images of her loved ones murdered by the Emperor flash before her eyes. She wonders where she went wrong. She tried so hard to be a good ruler, to protect them. Just as she resigns herself to death, a man appears, slowing his horse just to meet her away. He rushes to her side, thinking how absurd it is for a woman like her to die like this. Kneeling beside her, he wonders why she was ever born in Thanatos, why she had to suffer under the Emperor's rule. Her eyes, already lifeless, begin to close. Taman pulls her stiff body into his arms, furious at himself for not finding her sooner. Cradling her head, he whispers that if she didn't want this life, he'd take it for himself. His fingers trace her lips, then her cheeks, before he presses his mouth to hers, claiming her as his own. Their story isn't simple. Long ago, driven by curiosity, God gathered materials to create humans. He carefully mixed in emotions, pleased with his work, but he wanted to fill them with kindness. Unfortunately, the moment he looked away, the devil leaped into the cauldron, and everything changed. The people who appeared at every step stood at the crossroads of good and evil. They fought over small things, started wars for no reason, and hid their goodness by hurting one another. When the supreme God saw this, he grew furious. He tore apart the creator of mankind as punishment for the imbalance. Scattering the pieces across the earth, he created the 6 elemental deities, sealing their power into objects. The remaining fragments entered human minds, giving them strange abilities. Taman carried the power of life. He kissed Rosalind, sharing his strength with her, giving a piece of himself. Now, as he rushed back to camp, with the Empress in his arms, he couldn't believe he had ever touched her. He was sure she would live. She had to, because he had already taken her with him. Meanwhile, his comrade worked to set up a temporary camp in the snowy wilderness. He watched his warriors shiver with bitter amusement, wondering how the Empire's people endured such cold. When Taman arrived, all eyes turned to him. He ignored the man's angry protests, walking past without a word, wrapping Rosalind in his sheepskin coat. His friend could only stare as the curtain swayed behind them. Stunned by the absurdity of the minister kidnapping the Empress, Taman carried Rosalind to the bed, relieved she was finally safe. She was unconscious, unaware of the sudden change. He sat beside her, lost in thought, studying her exhausted face. He remembered how regal she had looked during their last meeting. Back then, Amir had tried to trade an island for protection against pirates. Rosalind saw through the offer immediately. Taman had smirked, downplaying the risks, but she was unshakable. When he suggested another island, his true motive slipped out. The Empress knew a ship from Amur had wrecked there, losing precious jewels. She played him perfectly, revealing her family had already claimed the treasure. In the end, she agreed to return it, but only in exchange for exclusive rights to the red cocoon, a rare resource from Amur. Now, standing over her, he remembered how she had outmaneuvered him without losing her poise. He watched as her breathing grew uneven, her fever rising. The power he'd given her on the snowy plain might not be enough. He wondered what else he could do to save her. Taman wrapped his arm around Rosalind's back, thinking about how she had once been his enemy on the diplomatic front. He pulled her exhausted, fragile body closer, confused by his own inability to bear her pain. Pressing his lips to hers again, he transferred his life force, hoping to improve her condition. A surge of energy rushed through Rosalind's mouth, and her eyes flew open. Seeing Taman's closed eyes, she realized what was happening and jerked away as if burned, slapping him across the cheek. Staring at him in shock, she demanded to know what he was doing. He calmly replied that he was treating her. Unconvinced, she argued that this wasn't treatment and insisted he return her to the icy mountain. His response that he wanted her alive caught her off guard. When he grabbed her wrist, she begged him to let her die. He stared at her like she was speaking another language, unable to understand why she spoke so lightly of her own life. His gaze dropped to her battered hands as she explained that after everything she'd endured, she no longer wanted to live. The Empress had lost everything: her loved ones, her power, any chance to undo the past. Taman's voice rose in disbelief. Did she truly wish to die so easily after years of service? Deep down he hoped she'd deny it, but she remained silent. After a long pause, her slender fingers curled around his arm. Finally, she admitted she had been nothing but a headache to him, making him want to crush her. With a tired smile she pulled his hand to her throat, begging him to end her suffering. The plea struck him hard. Rosalind's glassy eyes held no will to live, only a desperate plea for death. Without realizing it, his hands closed around her throat. He could feel how fragile she was, how easily he could break her. But he couldn't do it. He tore his hands away, refusing to be the weapon of her destruction. Instead, he grabbed her injured leg, squeezing it firmly. She gasped in surprise as he pressed his lips to the wound, ignoring her protests. She tried to pull away, demanding an explanation. Without looking up, he ordered her to stay still. When she begged him to stop, his anger flared. He was ready to leave if she truly wanted to die, but then he froze mid-sentence. Taman moves closer to Rosalind without thinking, his voice almost a scream as he tells her to keep fighting until the end. He can't believe she's giving up, so he orders her to fight, not just for him, but for everyone else. He reminds her of how strong she used to be and insists she can't quit now. For a moment, Rosalind must have realized this man believed in her more than she believed in herself. Even though they had once been enemies. After a long talk and painful treatment, Taman finally steps out of the tent. He pauses at the entrance, holding the curtain, and glances back one last time. Rosalind is still asleep, resting comfortably in the large bed they had shared. Meanwhile, the palace of Thanatos buzzes with tension because of the Emperor's latest actions. Gigliotti stands tall in front of his messenger, the same man he had sent to gather information. Doubtful, the Emperor sharply asks if he's certain the Empress is dead. The messenger confidently says yes, but Gigliotti questions how he can be so sure when her body was never found. The Emperor grows uneasy as servants report finding bloody footprints, likely from a beast attack. That wasn't the only task though. When Gigliotti asks about Rosalind's relic, the messenger hesitates, staring at the floor. He guesses it was stolen long ago since they never found it. The Emperor's temper flares. He refuses to believe it, knowing the Empress always wore the jewelry. Frustrated, he orders the man to search every place connected to Rosalind and find the relic. As the messenger leaves, Gigliotti is suddenly hit by a sickening wave of weakness. He covers his mouth, feeling like he might vomit before even reaching the bathroom. The imperial family's power is death, but its form varies with each generation. Gigliotti's ability is limited. He can only infect people with a deadly plague. Every time he uses it, he suffers the consequences, just like now, after wiping out Rosalind's followers. No matter how hard he tried, he could never kill the Empress directly because of an old wedding rite. During their ceremony, she drank his blood mixed with holy water, binding them so neither could kill the other. He had tried other methods, but Rosalind's sacred relic always protected her. Now, believing she's finally dead, Gigliotti bursts into laughter, overjoyed. He's convinced he's won, that his greatest enemy is gone. Raising his hands in triumph, he shouts that he's done it, only to freeze at the sound of movement behind him. He turns just in time to see the heavy portrait of Rosalind's dead brother hurtling toward him. With a terrified cry, he leaps aside as the painting crashes to the floor, barely missing him. A bunch of servants rushed into the room the moment they heard his piercing scream. They found him lying on the floor, a meter away from the portrait. Not wanting to explain what had happened, he angrily ordered them to help him up. Once on his feet, Gigliotti noticed the massive portrait in front of him and immediately demanded it be removed. But this wasn't the last unsettling incident. Soon, another painting caught his eye. Surrounded by servants, he stared at Rosalind's portrait as if her horrible gaze were devouring him from the wall. The majestic painting made during their past life together completely captured his attention. Unable to bear it, he drew his sword and began slashing at the image, shouting wildly. Exhausted, he dropped the weapon and gasped for breath, begging her to die. The Emperor ignored the people around him, lifting his eyes once more to the terrifying portrait, his gaze locked onto the painted but dreadful eyes of the Empress, whose image he had just destroyed. He collapsed to the floor, weeping like a child and clutching his head, alarming the servants around him. Meanwhile, Taman and his followers were nearing the borders of his homeland, surrounded by scorching sand and sun. He carefully settled Rosalind beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, knowing she wasn't used to the heat. The former Empress studied his face thoughtfully, trying to recall how long she'd been with him. Fragments of their last night when their sudden betrayal had unfolded flashed in her mind. Curious, she stretched out her arms and examined them, comparing their condition to before. Despite never using healing ointments, her wounds had improved drastically. She wondered if it was because of the man beside her who had cared for her so diligently. Rosalind looked away, lost in thought. She refused to believe he could possess the last fragment of divine power. Its wielder had never been revealed to anyone. Noticing her shift in mood, Taman asked how she was feeling, snapping her out of her thoughts. Rosalind met his gaze and admitted that even though he'd saved her, she could still die at any moment. In response, he pulled her closer and grinned, saying he didn't care. Gripping the reins and her tightly, he swore he'd save her as many times as needed. She wanted to argue but was distracted by the sight of towering walls ahead the main city. Taman drew her attention and calmly announced they'd finally reached his homeland, where she would stay now. Before them stood a grand sand fortress surrounded by bright flowers, endless dunes and a warm blue sea. Crowds of excited citizens cheered for the Grand Minister and General Taman as he arrived with his delegation. He glanced at the crowd, then at Rosalind, and seeing her worsening state, decided to leave quickly. Meanwhile, Rosalind was drenched in sweat, struggling with the sudden, harsh change in climate. Taman turned to his comrade Ronasso, ready to ask him to cover for him while he was away. He told Ronasso he had urgent business and would leave first, so all reports should go to him. Without waiting for the red-haired man's reply, Taman galloped off, making Ronasso even angrier at his boldness. Taman raced to his palace, worried about the woman in his arms, who wasn't used to such rough travel. When they arrived, a crowd of nervous servants rushed to greet him. Ignoring his butler's questions about who he was carrying, Taman only asked if the water he'd requested was ready. Soon, he stood before the door to the pool room, guided by a servant. Stepping inside, he carried the Empress in his arms and ordered no one to disturb them. Once the door shut, he laid her on the tiles beside the hot pool. Stripping down to his underwear, he removed her white cape, which had covered her during the journey. Taman checked her body and smiled, pleased to see her wounds had healed. Even the bruises were fading. He lifted the half-asleep girl and stepped into the water, sinking up to his legs. The heat jolted her awake, and she gasped, glaring at him. Rosalind demanded to know where they were. He grinned and told her they were in his home, his private bathroom. She turned away, muttering about the absurd size of the room. Then her eyes widened when she spotted a stand holding his belongings, including a dagger. Taman noticed where she was looking and crossed his arms, asking what had caught her attention. Rosalind stood and moved closer, arguing again that he'd made a mistake saving her. Unfazed, he smirked and said he decided what was right or wrong. She stepped back, calling him insolent. He shrugged, saying everyone had a bit of boldness in them. As she edged toward the pool's far side, she kept questioning his motives. When she asked directly, he stayed silent, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on her chest. Rosalind laughed, teasing him for being flustered by a woman's body. Embarrassed, he scratched his head and admitted he hadn't expected to be so taken with a foreign empress. She gave him a cold look and told him to find someone else instead of bothering her. Taman smirks and agrees that many people want to get him, but none compare to her. The Empress calls his words nonsense, insisting she has nothing to offer, but he clearly disagrees. He doesn't accept her low opinion of herself and considers telling her so. Instead, he watches as she steps out of the water and starts listing her strengths: her heart, her mind, her body. Holding out his hand, he smiles and says he wants all of it, every part of her. She grins triumphantly and tells him he's out of luck because he wasn't paying attention, he'll get nothing. While they spoke, she had already moved swiftly, reaching the wall and drawing a blade. Without hesitation, she presses it to her throat and makes a cut, declaring she now has nothing left to give him. Taman is stunned as blood spills onto the floor at her feet. Furious, he lays her down, scolding her for trying to take her own life again after he saved her. His angry words barely reach her, and she's surprised people usually wanted her dead before. Memories flash in her mind, including a conversation with the Emperor after days of torture. But Taman is different. He fights to save her, pressing his lips hard against her bleeding neck while cradling her head. He holds her weak body, relieved the wound isn't deep. When she opens her eyes, he glares, furious she dared to try dying again. Leaning closer, he tells her he saved her by giving his own life force. Finally, he pulls her into a gentle hug, holding her carefully, just glad she's alive. Too weak to resist, Rosalind leans against him, listening as he speaks. Without waiting for a reply, Taman tightens his grip, declaring firmly that she's his now. Meanwhile, Ronasso is in trouble. He meets Queen Theolantifu of Amor, and with Taman missing, he's nervous when she asks why he hasn't gone to the palace. He hesitates, turning away, scrambling for an excuse. Recovering, he flatters her, changing the subject. But she presses him about Taman's whereabouts, forcing him to think fast. Finally, he claims Taman fell ill after arguing with Emperor Thanatos. Seeing Theo's displeasure, he backtracks, saying he didn't mean anything by it and quickly excuses himself. The queen smirks, unsurprised she finds the emperor's family disgusting. Still, she's intrigued, saying this is the first time Taman's illness has been so severe. She muses about visiting him, but Ronasso panics, trying everything to stop her. He suddenly starts telling her about the Emperor of Thanatos and what he's done this time, asking if she knows about it. At first, she hesitates, thinking over his words, but then, with admiration, suggests they hold a banquet to celebrate their return. Ronasso sighs in relief, glad to have dealt with her, and calmly heads back to the palace. Meanwhile, one writer breaks away from the group after a girl, the same one who had spoken to Theo earlier, stops him. After a brief exchange, the black-haired girl convinces him to follow her instead. The rest of the column doesn't notice his absence, so he slips away, trailing behind her. Elsewhere, Taman uses his life force transfer skill again, pressing his lips to the former empress's. She feels his body against hers and can't help but question if this is really the right way to heal. Rosalind places a hand on his chest and pushes him away, breaking the kiss. Reluctantly, he pulls back, both of them breathing heavily. Noticing her discomfort, Taman studies her face and sees her look away, uneasy and unwilling. Despite her doubts, she does feel completely healed after his magic. Grinning, he asks if she regrets not being able to die now. When she stays silent, he tells her not to look at him like that. Her expression stirs something in him. His words linger in her mind. After all the cruel things the emperor had said, mocking her, comparing her to a doll, she had started to doubt herself. Realizing Taman is waiting for a response, she lowers her eyes and asks him to leave her alone. At first, he thinks she disliked the healing, but then she fires back, should she still obey his orders now? He freezes as she sits on the floor, demanding to know if he'll keep saving her like this. The Empress is firm, insisting she alone will decide whether she lives or dies. Taman looks away, quietly agreeing. When he glances back, he's pleased to see her looking like her old self again, strong, regal, not the broken woman begging for death. Smiling, he thinks she's even more beautiful now, arguing with him, standing her ground. He reaches out, wanting to touch her, to say something kind. Gently holding her chin, he admits she drives him crazy. But she swats his hand away, telling him to stop. Turning her face, she reveals a cut on her neck and warns him not to touch it. When she snaps at him not to kiss her whenever he wants, he falls silent. Rosalind was surprised by how approvingly the man reacted to her fierce defense of his boundaries. He promised not to do it again, guiltily closing his eyes as he repeated that he wouldn't kiss her lips since she disliked it so much. His words were firm, his gaze stern as he looked into her eyes, making her believe his oath.